The executive office of the Sterling estate didn't feel like a room. It felt like a refrigerator. Julian Sterling, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, sat behind a desk of obsidian that was as cold as his own reputation. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city of Sterling was a glittering jewel of glass and steel, but inside, Julian felt the first tremors of a landslide. He wasn't looking at quarterly earnings. He was looking at a disposal list. Leaked by Detective Vance, the digital ledger on his desk glowed with the names of Omegas who had expired their debt. It wasn't just money. It was a tally of human souls sold into the shadows. "The board is asking for you, Julian." The voice was like silk sliding over a blade. Marcus Sterling leaned against the doorframe, adjusting a cufflinks that cost more than an Omega's yearly salary. He smelled of expensive bourbon and the terrifying confidence of a man who thought he had already won. Julian didn't look up. "This ledger, Marcus. It says we've repossessed 3 apartment blocks in the slums this month. Where did the families go?" Marcus let out a light, airy chuckle, crossing the room to pour a drink. The ice clinked against the crystal, a sharp, biting sound. "They went where all failed assets go, cousin. Into the system. They're working off their debt in the factories. It's efficient. It's clean. Clean," Julian repeated. He finally looked up, his steel-gray eyes boring into Marcus with the weight of a physical blow. "It looks like blood to me." "Then stop looking," Marcus snapped, his mask of politeness slipping for a fraction of a second. "You sit in this ivory tower while I do the dirty work that keeps your crown shiny. Don't start growing a conscience now. It's bad for the stock price." Julian watched him leave, the silence that followed heavier than the air before a storm. He looked at his hands, clean, manicured, useless. He realized then that as long as he wore the suit, he would only ever see what Marcus allowed him to see. To find the truth, he had to become the very thing his cousin considered a failed asset. Underscore 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 underscore. The smell of the Omega slums was a cocktail of damp concrete, old grease, and desperation. Clara Bennett didn't mind the smell. She was too busy trying to ignore the hunger gnawing at her ribs like a physical beast. She knelt on the floor of the communal kitchen, scrubbing the soot from a stove that hadn't worked in a week. Her fingers were cracked and blue from the cold, the skin raw from cheap lye. "Clara? Is it tonight?" She turned to see Toby standing in the shadows of the hallway. He looked like a ghost, pale, thin, his ribs visible through his threadbare shirt. He was 14, but he had the eyes of an old man. "Is what tonight, Toby?" she whispered, forcing a smile that felt like it might break her face. "The collection," he breathed, his voice trembling. "I heard Sarah saying the guards are coming to take anyone who can't pay the new tax. She said they're taking the unfit first." Clara's heart seized. Toby, with his delayed shift and fragile health, was the definition of unfit in Marcus Sterling's world. She reached into her hidden pocket, feeling the small, hard crust of bread she had scavenged from the bakery bins. It was all they had left. "They aren't taking you," Clara promised, her voice turning to iron. "I'll give them everything. I'll give them my blood if I have to. But they aren't taking you." She didn't know that less than a mile away, her king was stripping off his silk tie and rubbing ash into his skin, preparing to walk into her nightmare. The obsidian desk was a frozen lake under the harsh LED lights of the Sterling estate, reflecting a man who no longer recognized the kingdom he built. Julian Sterling did not look at his cousin as Marcus entered. He stayed focused on the digital ledger that whispered of a rot deep within the pack's foundations. The names of missing Omegas pulsed like open wounds on the screen, lives reduced to defaulted assets. "The board is waiting, Julian," Marcus said, his voice a polished silk that set Julian's nerves on edge. He smelled of expensive bourbon and the terrifying confidence of a man who believed his own lies. "The quarterly earnings are historic. We've achieved a level of efficiency your father only dreamed of. Julian finally looked up, his steel gray eyes cutting through the beta's manufactured charm. Efficiency, Marcus? Or extortion? I have reports of Omegas being repossessed for debts that didn't exist 6 months ago. Entire families have vanished from the lower districts. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he poured himself a drink, the ice clinking against the crystal with a sharp, biting sound. A few malcontents spreading rumors because they don't want to work, Julian. I've personally overseen the relocation programs. They are being given housing and labor in the outer sectors. It's clean. It's necessary for the pack's growth. And the disappearances? Julian pressed, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. Logistics, Marcus replied smoothly, spreading his hands. They're being integrated into new roles. If they aren't here, it's because they're finally contributing elsewhere. Don't let a few anonymous emails distract you from the crown you wear. It's a heavy burden. Let me handle the dirt, so you can stay gold. Julian watched him leave, the silence that followed heavier than the air before a mountain storm. Marcus had lied perfectly, too perfectly. It was the rehearsed ease of a predator who had forgotten that his king was also a wolf. Julian stood, but he didn't head for the boardroom. He moved toward the private antechamber where Arthur, the elderly royal butler, stood waiting like a silent sentinel of a more honorable era. Without a word, Julian reached up and removed the heavy gold band from his brow, the weight of it leaving a physical ache behind. He set the crown on a velvet cushion and pulled a ring of silver keys from his pocket. "Keep these safe, Arthur," Julian commanded, his voice stripped of its royal resonance. "If Marcus asks, tell him I am in deep meditation and am not to be disturbed for any reason." Arthur looked at the crown, then at the king's manicured hands, and finally into Julian's eyes. He saw the fire of a hunt beginning. "And where will you be, sire?" Julian grabbed a rough, charcoal-stained coat from a hidden trunk, a relic of a different life. "I'm going to find the people my cousin thinks are invisible." As he rubbed wood ash into the sharp lines of his jaw and messed his hair into a tangled ruin, Julian Sterling ceased to exist. In his place stood a man with no name, no power, and nothing but the cold truth waiting for him in the mud. The transition from the sterile marble of the estate to the grit of the lower districts felt like falling from the sky and hitting the pavement. By the time Julian reached the central market of the Sterling district, he was no longer the Alpha King. He was a shadow, his skin stained with soot and his powerful scent suppressed by the pungent musk of the city's refuse. He wore the rags of a laborer, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped to hide the broad, warrior-built frame that usually commanded a room. The market was a cacophony of commerce and cruelty. Julian moved through the crowds, his eyes darting toward the faces of people who had, only days ago, stood in his presence with practiced reverence. He passed a prominent merchant who had once gifted him a stallion. Now, the man didn't even see him. When Julian accidentally brushed against the merchant's silk sleeve, the man didn't offer a polite nod. He recoiled as if touched by a leper, his face twisting in a sneer of pure disgust. "Watch where you're going, filth," the merchant hissed, wiping his arm as if Julian's very presence had left a permanent stain. Julian felt a hot flash of alpha rage spark in his chest, but he choked it down, forcing himself to look at the cobblestones. The invisibility was absolute, but it was the silence that chilled him. He watched as his own guards, men who wore the Sterling crest on their chests, patrolled the stalls with a predatory arrogance. They weren't protecting the people, they were stalking them. He paused near a fruit stall, his stomach letting out a hollow growl that wasn't feigned. He hadn't eaten since the previous morning. As he reached out a hand toward a bruised apple that had fallen into the gutter, a heavy boot slammed into his ribs. The force of the kick sent Julian sprawling into the mud, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp wheeze. He looked up through a tangle of matted hair to see a young guard he had personally commissioned only a year ago. The boy's face was flushed with a sense of unearned power. "Keep moving, Beggar," the guard spat, resting a hand on his baton. "We don't want your kind cluttering up the walkway." Marcus's orders. The district is to be kept aesthetically pure for the evening gala. Julian lay in the filth, the taste of dust and copper filling his mouth. No one stopped to help. No one looked his way. The citizens walked around his prone body as if he were merely an uneven stone in the street. In the palace, he was a god. Here, in the heart of his own kingdom, he was less than a ghost. He pushed himself up, his ribs screaming in protest, and realized with a terrifying clarity that the sterling prosperity was a gilded cage, and the key had been thrown away long ago. He wasn't just here to watch Marcus. He was here to witness the death of his pack's soul. The cold had begun to settle into Julian's bones, a predatory chill that no amount of royal willpower could suppress. He had crawled into the shadow of a narrow alleyway behind the merchant stalls, his body aching from the guard's boot and the hollow, gnawing vacuum of hunger. The mud seeped through his threadbare trousers, and for the first time in his life, Julian Sterling felt small. He felt disposable. He leaned his head against the damp brickwork, watching the boots of his subjects hurry past the mouth of the alley, a blur of indifference that felt more painful than the physical assault he had endured. "Don't go near him, Clara," a sharp, nasally voice hissed from the street. Julian cracked an eye open to see a woman in a sturdy wool coat, Sarah, a frequent fixture at palace garden parties, pulling at the arm of another woman. "He's probably a drug addict or a deserter. You're already behind on your tax. Don't waste your breath on trash that's only going to be swept away tonight. He's a man, Sarah. Not trash," a softer voice replied. It was melodic, yet carried an undercurrent of exhaustion that Julian recognized as the sound of a spirit being pushed to its absolute limit. A moment later, the light at the end of the alley was obscured. A young woman stepped into the shadows. She was thin, her face gaunt beneath a layer of soot, but her eyes held a clarity that the high-born ladies of his court lacked. This was Clara. She didn't look at him with the revulsion of the merchant or the arrogance of the guard. She looked at him with the haunting recognition of a fellow survivor. She knelt in the muck, ignoring the way the filth ruined her hem. From beneath her thin tunic, she pulled a small, hard crust of bread, a meager scrap that Julian knew was likely her only meal for the day. She broke it in half, the dry snap sounding like a gunshot in the quiet alley, and held the larger portion out to him. "It's not much," she whispered, her voice trembling as much from the cold as from the weight of her sacrifice. "But it will stop the shaking." Julian stared at her hand, his throat tightening. He was the king who owned the granaries, the bakeries, and the soil itself, yet as he took the bread from her raw, cracked fingers, it felt like the most valuable tribute he had ever received. Before he could speak, she began unwinding a faded, patched shawl from around her own narrow shoulders. Despite the biting wind whistling through the alley, she draped the warmth over his trembling frame. "Clara, honestly," Sarah called out from the street, her heels clicking away in a huff. "You'll be shivering by midnight. You can't save everyone." Clara didn't look back. She stayed for a moment longer, her hand resting briefly, gently, on Julian's soot-stained shoulder. "Eat," she urged softly. "The night is long, and the guards are restless. You'll need your strength to stay hidden." As she stood and disappeared back into the crowd, Julian clutched the bread to his chest. The warmth of the shawl began to seep into his skin, but it was the weight of her mercy that truly anchored him. He had come to the slums to find a traitor, but instead, he had found the heartbeat of his kingdom, and it was starving. The walk to the edge of the industrial district was a slow, agonizing trek through shadows that grew longer and colder with every step. Clara walked with a protective vigilance, her small frame braced against the wind, while Julian followed, wrapped in her threadbare shawl. The shack on the hill was a generous name for the structure they eventually reached. It was a leaning lean-to of corrugated metal and salvaged timber, clinging to the side of a soot-stained ridge. Inside, the air smelled of damp earth and the metallic tang of hunger, but it was dry. "Toby? It's just me," Clara called out softly, her voice acting as a beacon in the dim interior. A young boy emerged from a nest of old blankets in the corner. Toby was painfully thin, his eyes too large for a face that had forgotten how to be young. He looked at Julian, the jewels of the streets, with a mix of instinctive fear and desperate hope. Julian's heart twisted. He had seen thousands of children in his parades, but he had never seen the hollow look of a wolf shifter whose inner spirit was being starved into silence. "I found a friend, Toby. He's going to rest here for a while," Clara said, herding them toward the small center table where a single candle flickered. As Clara moved to the hearth to boil a pot of thin water, Julian sat on a rickety crate, his eyes scanning the room. He saw the stack of notice of arrears, papers weighted down by a heavy stone on the table. He reached out, his fingers brushing the parchment. The documents bore the official Sterling seal, but the math was a chaotic nightmare. "The shadow tax," Toby whispered, seeing Julian's interest. "The guards come every Friday. They say if we don't pay the interest on the protection levy, they'll take me to the processing center. They say my shift is late because I'm a debt to the pack's resources." Julian's blood turned to liquid fire. He recognized the signatures at the bottom of the notices. They weren't official pack treasury marks. They were private authorizations from Marcus's personal office. The protection levy was a fabrication, a phantom debt designed to be unpayable. Marcus wasn't just managing the Omegas. He was harvesting them, using the fear of repositioning to strip them of every cent and every ounce of dignity they possessed. "How much do you owe?" Julian asked, his voice a low, raspy growl that made Toby flinch. "More than we'll ever have," Clara answered from the stove, her back to him. Her voice cracked. "Every time we pay, the interest doubles by morning. It's a hole with no bottom, Jules. We're just waiting for the day they decide we aren't worth the space we take up." Julian looked at the bread crust on the table, the half she had kept for her brother. He realized with a staggering, nauseating certainty that Marcus hadn't just lied to him. His cousin had turned the Sterling name into a curse. The debt was a lie, a shackle made of ink and paper, and Julian was the only one who could break it, if he could survive the night without revealing his throat to the wolves. The following night, the air grew thick with a premonition of violence, a heavy dampness that seemed to cling to the soot-stained walls of the district. Julian slipped away from the shack while Clara and Toby slept, his movements ghost-quiet despite the lingering ache in his ribs. He navigated the labyrinth of the lower wards until he reached a derelict warehouse near the docks, where the smell of salt and rotting timber masked the scent of anything living. In the deepest shadows of the loading bay, a figure detached itself from the gloom. Detective Vance looked older than he had a week ago, his face lined with exhaustion that even his sharp, observant eyes couldn't hide. He didn't bow, not here, where a royal gesture could be a death sentence, but his voice held a gravelly reverence. "Sire, I began to fear the streets had swallowed you whole. The streets have more honor than my palace, Vance," Julian rasped, his voice still rough from the dust of the market. He leaned against a rusted pillar, the king's authority flickering briefly in his weary gaze. "I've seen the notices. I've seen the shadow tax. It's a harvesting operation. Marcus isn't just stealing their money, he's stealing their lives." Vance nodded grimly, pulling a crumpled dispatch from his coat. "It's worse than we feared. Marcus knows the anonymous reports have reached the throne, even if he thinks you're safely tucked away in meditation. He's moving up the timeline. He's calling it a slum revitalization initiative, but the internal memos tell a different story. It's a cleansing, Julian." Julian's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into a white-knuckled fist. "Define cleansing." "Total erasure," Vance whispered, the word hanging like a noose in the air. "By tomorrow night, the guards have orders to clear the hill. Anyone with outstanding debt, which, thanks to his fabricated interest, is everyone, will be loaded into transports. They aren't going to labor camps, sire. They're being moved to the northern wasteland border. It's a death march." He's burning the evidence and the witnesses in one stroke. The realization hit Julian with the force of a physical blow. Clara, Toby, the woman who had shared her last scrap of bread, was scheduled for execution by the very laws Julian was supposed to uphold. The cleansing wasn't just a cover-up, It was a massacre disguised as policy. "He thinks I'm a beggar," Julian said, a low, predatory growl vibrating in his chest, the first real sound of the Alpha King returning to the surface. "He thinks he's clearing out the trash. Let him come. Tell your loyalists to be ready, Vance. If Marcus wants a cleansing, we will give him one, but it will start with his own seat at my table." The following evening, the silence of the slums was shattered by the rhythmic, heavy thud of military boots and the sharp glare of high-intensity spotlights. The slum revitalization had begun, not with architects and planners, but with iron batons and zip ties. Julian stood in the shadows of the shack's entrance, his alpha instincts screaming for blood as he watched Marcus Sterling's personal guard drag families from their homes. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and terrified omega pheromones, a sensory assault that made Julian's wolf claw at the back of his mind.
"Out."
"Everyone into the street," the lead guard bellowed, kicking in the door of the neighboring shanty. Clara stood in the center of their small room, her arms wrapped tightly around a trembling Toby. She looked at Julian, her eyes wide with a frantic, silent plea for him to run, to save himself. But Julian didn't move. He stood like a statue of soot and shadow, his eyes fixed on the door as it was kicked off its hinges. Marcus Sterling stepped into the cramped space, looking like a god of marble and silk in the midst of a landfill. He held a silk handkerchief to his nose, his expression one of bored disdain until his gaze settled on Clara. He ignored Julian entirely. To Marcus, the man in the corner was just more refuse to be discarded. But Clara was different. In the harsh, artificial light, her defiant posture and the raw, haunting beauty of her face seemed to arrest him. "Well now," Marcus murmured, lowering the handkerchief. He stepped closer, his expensive boots crunching on the brittle floorboards. He reached out a gloved hand, tilting Clara's chin upward. "I don't recall seeing this particular asset in the reports. You're far too exquisite to be wasted on a northern labor camp. Leave her alone," Toby cried out, his voice cracking with a courage he didn't possess. Marcus didn't even look at the boy. He simply gestured to a guard, who shoved Toby into the wall with a sickening thud. "The boy's debt is substantial," Marcus said, his thumb tracing the line of Clara's jaw. "His shift is delayed. His health is poor. He's a drain on the pack's resources. By law, I should process him immediately." Clara's breath hitched.
"Please."
"I'll do anything. I'll work double shifts." "I have a better idea," Marcus smiled, a predatory glint in his eyes that made Julian's vision swim with red. "A debt of this size requires a personal collateral. I think I'll collect you instead, little bird. You'll find life in my private estate much more comfortable than a grave in the wasteland." He leaned in closer, his voice a foul whisper. "Consider it a mercy. Your brother might even live through the week if you're particularly cooperative." Behind them, in the darkness, the beggar finally stood straight. The slouch vanished, replaced by a terrifying, silent lethalness. Julian's shadow grew long and jagged against the wall, but Marcus was too blinded by his own arrogance to notice that the predator was no longer outside the house. He was standing right behind him. The air in the cramped shack curdled, turning thick and heavy as if the oxygen had been replaced by liquid lead. As Marcus leaned in to claim his collateral, his fingers tightening on Clara's chin, the man in the corner didn't just stand. He ascended. The slouch that had defined Jules the beggar vanished, replaced by a terrifying, predatory grace. Julian's spine straightened with a series of audible cracks, and as he stepped into the light, the soot and ash on his face seemed to burn away beneath the heat of a rising fury. "Take your hands off her," Julian said. It wasn't a shout. It was a vibration that rattled the corrugated metal walls and hummed in the very marrow of the guard's bones. Marcus froze, his sneer faltering as he turned toward the voice. "What did you say, you piece of?" The insult died in his throat. Julian didn't wait for him to finish. He unleashed his alpha command, a psychic tidal wave of pure, unadulterated dominance that had been suppressed for days. The pressure was physical, a localized gravity that slammed into every wolf in the room. The guards, seasoned warriors of the Sterling elite, collapsed instantly. Their knees hit the floorboards with bone-shattering force, their foreheads pressed into the grime as their inner wolves whimpered in the presence of their true king. Marcus buckled, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he fought the invisible weight. He gasped for air, his eyes bulging as he looked up at the beggar. Julian stood over him, his steel-gray eyes glowing with a lethal, golden hue that marked him as the apex predator of the realm. The rags he wore no longer mattered. The authority radiating from him was so absolute that the room seemed to shrink around his presence. "You spoke of assets and logistics, Marcus," Julian rasped, his voice now a terrifying resonance that made the shadows dance. "You spoke of mercy while you bled my people dry." Julian reached down, his hand closing around Marcus's throat with the speed of a striking viper. He lifted the beta off the ground as if he weighed nothing. Clara watched from the floor, her breath hitching in her chest, her eyes wide as she realized the man she had fed with her last crust of bread was the very God she had prayed to for deliverance. "The meditation is over," Julian growled into Marcus's terrified face. "And I have seen enough." With a flick of his wrist, Julian threw Marcus through the open doorway and into the mud of the street. He turned back to Clara, the golden fire in his eyes softening for a fleeting second, a silent promise that the nightmare was ending before he stepped out into the night to reclaim his throne in blood. The Sterling Estate's grand hall had never been so crowded, yet never so silent. The highborn families who had spent the week ignoring the beggar in the streets now sat in rows of velvet chairs, their faces pale as they looked toward the obsidian throne. Julian Sterling sat atop it, no longer in rags, but the soot still lingered in the creases of his knuckles, a deliberate reminder of where he had been. He wore his formal black military uniform, the silver crest of the Sterling pack gleaming under the chandeliers, but his expression was as cold as a winter tomb. Below the dais, Marcus Sterling was forced to his knees. He was disheveled, his expensive silk suit stained with the mud of the slums, his wrists bound in heavy silver shackles that dampened his wolf's power. Beside him stood Detective Vance, holding the stack of shadow tax ledgers that Julian had retrieved from the shack on the hill. Julian didn't look at the ledgers. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his tunic and pulled out a small, dried crust of bread, the half Clara had given him when he was nothing more than a ghost in an alleyway. He held it up, the meager scrap looking tiny and insignificant against the opulence of the hall. "My cousin told me that the omegas of this pack were assets that had reached their expiration." Julian's voice resonated through the chamber, a low thunder that made the guests flinch. "He told me they were a drain on our resources. Yet, when I was starving in the dirt, ignored by the very people I have protected for years, it was an omega with nothing who shared her last meal with a stranger. She didn't check my bank account. She didn't ask for my title. She saw a man in need, and she gave him half of her life." He looked down at Marcus, his eyes flashing with a predatory gold. "You didn't just steal their money, Marcus. You tried to steal the soul of this pack. You turned our strength into a weapon against the vulnerable." With a sharp gesture, Julian stood. The air pressure in the room surged, his alpha aura demanding absolute submission. "Marcus Sterling, for the crimes of high treason, embezzlement, and the illegal enslavement of pack members, I strip you of your rank, your name, and your lands. You are no longer a beta of this house. You are a pariah." The guard stepped forward, dragging the screaming Marcus toward the heavy doors. Julian didn't watch him go. His gaze drifted to the back of the hall, where Clara and Toby stood, dressed in clean clothes but still looking out of place amidst the marble. He held the bread for a moment longer before placing it on a velvet cushion beside his crown. It was no longer a scrap of food. It was the new foundation of his law. The golden hour of sunset spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the private royal solar, painting the room in hues of honey and amber. Julian stood by the glass, his silhouette sharp and commanding, yet his gaze was fixed on the lush gardens below. There, amidst the manicured hedges and blooming jasmine, Toby was running, not in fear, but in play. The boy's laughter drifted up on the breeze, a sound that held the budding strength of a wolf finally allowed to heal. For the first time, Toby looked like a child of the Sterling legacy rather than a casualty of its greed. A soft footfall sounded on the plush carpet behind him. Julian didn't need to turn to know it was Clara. Her scent, a grounding mixture of wild rain and warmth, had become the only thing that could truly quiet the alpha's restless mind. She moved with a newfound grace, though she still wore the simple, traditional fabrics she preferred over the heavy silks of the court. "He looks happy," she whispered, coming to stand a respectful distance away. "I never thought I'd see him breathe air that didn't taste like soot." Julian turned, his steel-gray eyes softening as they landed on her. The raw, cracked skin of her hands had begun to fade under the care of the palace healers, but the strength in her spirit remained as ironclad as the night they met in the mud. "He is home, Clara. And so are you, if you'll have us." Clara looked down at her hands, then back at the sprawling wealth of the estate. "I don't belong in a palace, Julian. I'm a girl from the alleys who cleans stoves and hides bread in her pockets. I don't know how to be a servant to a king." Julian stepped forward, closing the distance between them until the air hummed with the bond that had been forged in the darkness of the slums. He reached out, not with the arrogance of a ruler, but with the humility of the man she had saved. "I didn't ask you to be a servant. I've had 1,000 servants, and not one of them had the courage to show me the truth. I am asking you to stay as my equal, as my Luna." He saw the breath catch in her throat, the flicker of disbelief warring with a deep, soul-deep recognition in her eyes. "The pack, they expect a queen of high birth," she breathed. "The pack needs a queen of mercy," Julian countered, his voice a low, steady vow. "They need the woman who saw a beggar and saw a human being. I cannot rule this new world alone, Clara. I need the heart that shared its last crust of bread to help me lead." He reached for his crown, which sat on the side table. As he placed it back upon his brow, the gold didn't feel like a leaden weight of expectations and lies. It felt like a promise. He took Clara's hand, lifting it to his lips, and as they looked out over the kingdom together, the crown finally felt light. This sterling prosperity was no longer a ledger of debt, but a future built on the mercy of a girl who had once had nothing and a king who had finally found everything.